Our guest today was named president of Northwestern University just over 4 years ago. He is among the nation's leading authorities on the economics of higher education. He continues to teach economics and write extensively. Prior to being named president of Northwestern, our guest today was president of Williams College. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from Hofstra University and his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Our guest today and his wife, Mimi, have 3 children, Matt, Alyssa, and Rachel. Ladies and gentlemen, Morton Schapiro. Morty?
Well, thank you for such a warm reception. Big crowd. I'm amazed to hear there was a long waiting list. What do you say, 352? Yep. It's obviously the chicken parmesan, right? I should start serving that kind of food at more of my events and probably get more people. A whole bunch of Northwestern-related people. There's a lot of purple in the crowd. Raise your hand if you have some purple connection here. Okay, I'm going. That's intimidating. A whole bunch of board members there, too. Oh, my God. I feel like I'm about to call us to order and do a vote or something. So that's really exciting. And as was pointed out, my wife and 3 kids and I moved here now 3.5 years ago. It's my 4th year as 16th president of Northwestern. And everybody had always said that people were friendly in the Midwest. But I'm from the New York area, which means New Jersey. That's why you say New York area, because if you're from New York, you say, duh, New York. So I'm from the New York area. My wife is from the LA area, which means the Valley. And we never lived in the Midwest before. Never lived in the Midwest. And when this great opportunity was offered to me by Pat Ryan and Bill Osborne in December of '08, we said, boy, this is supposed to be the land of friendship. You know, we'd come here, we'd make a lot of friends, and and people would be really nice. And you know what? It's true. I had no idea. Don't tell the people on the coast. We don't want them here. But it really is great that we came here. And just to see so many people who came in. And if I started mentioning the names, I'd have a list as long as yours. And I'll never get a chance to say anything. But it really has been an incredible move for me and for my family. My son, Matty, lives in Wrigleyville. And my daughter, Alyssa, lives in Lincoln Park. And my little one, Rachel, lives with us in Evanston, and my wife loves it. And so I hope I don't mess up this talk. I'm looking at the executive committee of the board here now because my wife would leave me in a second. No, she wouldn't leave me. She would stay. I'd have to leave, and she would stay. So it's great to see so many friends here. One of the things I love having this opportunity to speak here. I was at Michael's. Michael, remember you gave a fabulous talk. I'm going to be at JB's on Monday, so I've been waiting for you. I've been sitting by the phone for like 3.5 years. Finally, you called, so I'm very excited to have this opportunity. And one of the things I appreciated was you didn't really tell me the topic, and I asked around. I said, was there a topic exactly? And I was a little worried because in the last 48 hours, 2 Northwestern, actually both members of the trustees, said they couldn't come for one reason or another. And one said, but I know, Mort, this is going to be your chance to tell everybody why, an undergrad might want to go to Northwestern as opposed to another great public or private, or maybe go to Kellogg as opposed to Booth or whatever. And I know you're going to tell them that. I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, that's my alumni talk. I love to give an alumni talk. I got one this morning from another member of the Board of Trustees and said, I know you're going to talk about how Northwestern's an engine of growth for the Chicagoland area and institution. I'm not going to talk about that. But if any of you ever want me to hear me talk about the joys of Northwestern and all the contributions we make, broadly defined, I give that talk about 3 times a week, and I'll be happy to tell you when the next one is, because it's one of my favorite talks. I'm so proud to be a faculty member and indeed the president of Northwestern. So I love speaking about that, but I'm not talking about that tonight. I'm talking tonight about economics of higher education, fully realizing even though a lot of people raised their hands about purple, being purple, that many of you really, you might have some relationship with Northwestern. You might have heard of us, for example, or something like that. But you probably, maybe you went to WashU, or maybe you went to Duke, or maybe you went to school in Urbana-Champaign, or maybe you went to Princeton, Dartmouth, whatever. So I want to talk more generally about my academic discipline, the economics of higher education. I'm going to talk about sort of what's going on. The way I want to do it is sort of 6 misconceptions about American higher education, and I will reference my work and other work, but a lot of my work, I'm thrilled to have Mike McPherson, who's the head of the Spencer Foundation, was president of Macalester College, and I've written and edited 7 books in my life. 6 of them were with Mike, and those 6 were much better than the one I did by my own. I don't know. So I don't know if it's causal or maybe, just a correlation. I don't know. But anyway, it's a thrill to have Mike here as well. And he can correct anything that I screw up, which is what we did together for about 25 years as co-authors. So what's the first misconception about American higher education? I wrote down, I don't have a lot of notes. I have 6 things written down. Let me tell you number one. Number one is the $50,000 price tag. And I hear about that all the time. And it's not just when you read the papers, and we have a lot of journalists here in the room, including a reporter who's about to take my picture. Hi, from the Daily Northwestern, the best college paper, university paper in the world. You read about the $50,000 above, and that's tuition, fees, and room and board. And we're actually all in this year, I think, at $58,000, which is similar for other schools and who are members of what we call COFI. You might have heard COFI. It stands for Consortium on Financing Higher Education. It was a group that was founded in the early 70s. It consists of 31 private, highly selective colleges and universities. The colleges, as you guess, are Swarthmore and Pomona and Oberlin and Carleton and Williams and Amherst and Wesleyan and Swarthmore. There's 13 of them. The 18 research universities are the 8 Ivies, plus, of course, University of Chicago and Washington University in St. Louis, and Duke and Georgetown and Northwestern and the like. So, when you read the paper, you think that, it's a ubiquitous experience out there that, our colleges and universities all charge, including room and board, north of $50,000. It is the case that the 31 COFI schools do, but those 31 are within a very small group who charge that kind of a sticker price. And a sticker price, very quickly, the first thing you teach in economics of higher education is a big difference between the net price a student or a family might pay versus the sticker price. Just like as if you buy a car, do you pay the sticker or do you get some kind of discount? So how many colleges and universities are out there in this country right now? There are about 1,700 publics, some of them are great flagships like Urbana-Champaign, and some of them are, community colleges, less selective publics, but those are public 1,700. There are about 1,700 private not-for-profits, like University of Chicago and WashU, and of course Northwestern. That's 3,400, and then there's about 1,200 or so what we call proprietaries, private for-profit colleges. Or universities, including, of course, the largest of us all is University of Phoenix. So there are 4,600 colleges and universities in this country. The total enrollment is about exactly 21 million. That includes 2.9 million graduate and professional students and 18.1 million undergrads. So you say, okay, 50,000 and above. Every time you read a novel, the kid's out of school paying 50,000 above. Every time you read a magazine, every time you watch the news, it's all, 50,000 above. Well, of the 4,600 for-profit and not-for-profit colleges and universities enrolling, again, 18.1 million undergrads, only 123 of those schools at a 4,600 charge, 50,000 above. Their total enrollment is about 600,000, again, out of 18.1 million. And then you realize that, in fact, about half of those kids, of those undergrads, of those 600,000 undergrads enrolled at those 123 universities and colleges, pay the sticker price. So there's 300,000. So the first enormous misconception, if you were coming from another country or coming from another planet or something, to be really exotic, and you landed here and you said, oh my God, everybody must be paying, just a fortune. How can they afford it? Well, the first answer is, again, if it's only half of the 600, that's 300,000. Do the math, 18.1, that's about that's fewer than 2 out of 100. So fewer than 2% of all the students in American higher education and their parents pay 50,000 and above. Now, I bet you it's more than 2% in this room, but I want you to feel very special. So if you're paying that kind of money, be really proud. So that's the first point I want to say. And I think it's important to understand that, again, you talk about affordability and they talk about, all kinds of things. How does the median family now, last time I looked, a couple months ago, for college-age kids makes about $58,000 a year. And say, well, how can you, what's the total cost in for, NU or University of Chicago or Penn or Princeton or Stanford or Dartmouth? It's 58. And so, well, that's median family income. Well, that's the second misconception, that the median family somehow pays. We say, okay, you're made $58,000, pay it, give it to us. And the reality, of course, is, as I said before, within the Kofi schools and more broadly among the 123 schools that have sticker prices north of $50,000, counting room and board, we have very generous need-based formulas. Within Kofi, the average, again, about half the kids pay the full sticker price north of 50. The other half pay, on average, only of about 1/3 of the sticker price. And that, again, includes room and board. So the second misconception is that, oh, my God, we're not affordable. How can it be affordable? But let me say, but let me say a few words about people in the audience today who are very proudly paying for their kids or maybe their grandchildren or whatever, for $50,000 or above. There aren't. Again, if you look at the American income distribution and you say how many people can really afford, if you look at a need-based formula, and need-based formulas I'll get to in a couple of minutes, are much more generous now than they were even 10 years ago. And you say, well, say you're paying that sticker price, can you really afford it? And the answer is, if you look at the percentage of after-tax income that we expect a very affluent family, a family within, say, the top 5% of the American income distribution, that's about $220,000 and above family income, do we asking for a higher percentage of your after-tax income to pay for the Northwesterns and the Dartmouths and Princetons and Williamses of the world, or smaller? And the answer is actually smaller. So the interesting thing, and people ask me all the time, they said, median family income doesn't change in real terms, but yet the sticker price over the last 30 or 40 years has gone up at a very rapid real pace. And they say, well, how can you do that? Well, the thing to keep in mind, and a lot of presidents don't like to talk about it because it looks like we're, as if we were operating as a for-profit, looking for that point of unitary elasticity on a demand curve and perfectly price discriminating. But the reality is, if you look at the rate of growth in after-tax income for the 5% richest Americans, basically from about 1979 to the present, that rate of growth, it pretty much tracks until very recently the growth in the sticker price. And people look at that and I say, well, why is that? Well, they're the ones who pay it. Okay, I'm not saying that therefore we act as if not as a 501c3 and that we're milking, again, the unitary part of a downward sloping demand curve. But what I am saying is you'd be crazy to increase the tuition, the sticker price, more than the income for the few people, the 1 out of 20 Americans who can actually afford to pay it. And what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the Kofi schools, the rate of growth in after-tax income for the richest 5% of Americans, in fact, has been increasing more rapidly than our sticker prices, which means you have more room for philanthropy. Thank you. We're accepting gifts today, as we always do. So that's one thing to keep in mind about the 123, are we milking the rich? And I think we're not. The other thing I have to say is that if you're listening to this and saying, okay, okay, they're trying to keep more or less their share of the after-tax income for the 5% of richest of Americans, that's a little different than the way most presidents describe the rate of growth in the sticker price, because they talk about how you spend the money on study abroad and more climbing walls and all this kind of great educational, enhancements. And then they say, but they talk about how you spend it. But again, as an economist, Mike and I are always focused more on sort of not how you spend the money, but will the market bear a certain price increase? And that's something I think that economics brings to brings to bear on this subject. So one other thing, if you're thinking about being special, and you're thinking, but don't they recycle that tuition money? If I'm paying $58,000 now for my kid at Yale this year, don't they recycle that for financial aid? I once got a letter when I was, and Mike, if you even know this story, when I was president of Williams, and it was a very interesting letter. It was from a parent, and they said, well, I know that, I'm one of the half of the parents at Williams who pay the full thing. At the time, it was, say, $50,000. including room and board. And I know that the other half only pay about 1/3. So I want you to write a letter that I can submit with my tax form for a tax deduction, because it probably means that at least 15 or 20,000 of that actually was a charitable deduction I made indirectly to Williams. And I wrote back. He picked the wrong person to write, to write. And I wrote back and I said, actually, you know, this is a good subject here, because if you really want to pursue this, it turns out that Kofi School typically spends about 80 to 85,000 per year to educate each undergrad. And you might think that's really expensive, but you know, most states spend 50,000 a year to keep someone in jail. And we have better rooms and better food and smaller classes. So when you think about that, the 80, 85,000 doesn't sound like it's ludicrous that we're throwing away money. So I wrote to this guy and I said, actually, sir, you paid 50 and we gave an $85,000 education. So here is a 1099 with imputed income for $35,000 that I am hereby submitting to the IRS. Never heard from the guy again. Fortunately, he wasn't related to a trustee. Otherwise, I would have left Williams even sooner. But anyway, so that's what's going on with the half who pay. But the half who don't pay, it's a really interesting story now, especially in the last 15 years. And I don't even have to talk about merit aid. I can just talk about need-based aid. And I actually brought a little, what do I have it here? I actually have a little, man, I lost it in the car already. I'll find it in a second. I actually had a little, I don't usually have props. Here it is. An article came out in the San Jose Mercury News, which I'm sure is a great paper, and it came out actually last March 4th of this past year, 2012, and it's called Believe It, Harvard Cheaper Than Cal State. Okay, everybody knows we're federally mandated to have a financial aid calculator on all of our web pages. And actually about a month ago, I sort of went on it, and you have to register, and you have to say what your family income is, how many kids are in college at the same time, what's the home equity you have, and you know, and et cetera, et cetera. And I actually did it, and I looked up, and then you can say, you know, what's the net price for someone with those circumstances? And I asked, actually, I think it was Duke, Chicago, WashU, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois, it's obviously a great flagship, and us. And I looked and I saw, and you can print it out, it's really nice. Well, this enterprising reporter that I mentioned that Medill is at Northwestern, one of the jewels in the crown, thank you, you know, came out and did exactly that. And it was really rather interesting. So you think about the half of the kids who are at the 123, 50,000 above, and what do they actually pay? And again, at Kofi, I said they pay about 20,000. That's what they did last year on average. But here's what this enterprising reporter did. He said, okay, let's take a family making 130,000 a year, and that's really the sweet spot for the differential in terms of public-private tuition, as you'll see in a second. And let's just say that parents are together, they're married, there's one other younger sib who's 14, and it just did the thing on again the federally mandated financial aid calculator, and it turned out that if the kid went locally to Cal State East Bay, the newest of the Cal State system, that it turned out that the charge, the net tuition and room and board and fees was $24,000. And then he did the same thing for a freshman going to UC Santa Cruz, you know, part of the great University of California. It was $33,000. And then he did it for Harvard, and it was $17,000. So this guy was shocked and awed. You know, I mean, Mike and I have been writing about this for decades. Nobody ever reads our stinking work. But if they did, they would have known that, of course, this really changed many years ago, right? So yeah, Harvard is $17,000. Then he did it for Yale, Williams, coincidentally, and Princeton. And all of them had a big difference. And it actually was for somebody earning, and I would say more broadly, typically somebody earning up to about $220,000, you know, top 5% that I mentioned before, quite often has a lower price tag to go to one of those 123 than to one of those other 4,600 minus 123. I don't think it's a shock. It's interesting. It does, though, very quickly, makes it more nuanced when I'm asked the one question I'm asked more often than anything else. And sometimes people call it the Penn versus Penn State question, right? Do you go to your best flagship private, or do you go to your great public flagship? And, you know, that's why it's called Penn versus Penn State. Mike and I did a little work earlier with colleague Jerry Berriman and Lori Kletzer and a couple of others. Alan Kruger, the head of the Council of Economic and head of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, wrote a series of papers. There's a nice little literature about that. It's not an easy answer. I always said, I always answered it by asking a question of my own. The first thing was, so here it's, do you go to University of Chicago or Northwestern as opposed to the great Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois' fabulous flagship? And the first thing I would ask is, well, can you graduate in 5 years at the public? I mean, in 4 years at the public, because a lot of the difference historically in room and board and differential tuition, is completely wiped out if it takes you 5 years to graduate at the public versus 4 years at a private. And it's not just for the direct costs, it's mainly for the indirect costs. Because if you can go to the private and graduate a year earlier, even if you're doing TFA, Teach for America, you get it over earlier before you go to Goldman, right? The classic kind of path. Save the world at least for a couple years, and let's get a summer home. So anyway, the opportunity cost. So the first thing I would say is it 4 years or 5 years, and if it's 5 years at the public, you're not. If you're doing this on economic grounds, you should probably go to the private. Not the public, if you can get out a year earlier. That was the first thing I would say. And then I would point out some stuff that Mike and I found, but a whole bunch of other people, including Alan Kruger, that the answer to how much financial return depends critically actually on your gender and your race. And I'll just say this quickly. You might want to follow it up with me after. It's a fascinating strain in the literature. The simple point is it matters a lot less if you're a white male than if you're an African-American male, for example. And you can say, and this is the returns to greater selectivity, and you can ask the question, why is it that if you're a white male, Caucasian male, it's probably not going to matter that much? You can save a few bucks if you can graduate in 4 years in Urbana versus in Evanston or in Hyde Park. And then the differential earnings, that age earning profile isn't all that different, so it pretty much is a wash. Actually, the Penn State, Alan Kruger famously said, for white men, it's probably a better financial decision actually to go to Penn State versus University of Pennsylvania. But, it changes if it's gender changes from male to female, and certainly if someone is of color. And the highest return that we found and others have found is basically for black men. You can say, well, why is it? Is it black men, if they go to an elite private versus a public, they get greater human capital, they learn more in that context? And the answer, of course, is no. It's credentialing. If you're an underrepresented person, not Asian American or Caucasian, if you're Hispanic or you're African American and you're a male, there's a lot of skepticism, and it's more important to say, guess where I graduated? I didn't go to the public. I graduated from a Kofi school, or I graduated from an Ivy. So the first question would say, can you graduate at the public in 5 years or 4 years? And then if it's 5, might as well go private. The second one is, if you're a white man, it probably doesn't matter anywhere as much as if you're a black man. But now I have to ask a third question. And the third question is, what's your income? Because the truth is, a la Harvard, cheaper than, believe it or not, like Ripley's, right? Harvard cheaper than Cal State East Bay, or much cheaper, half the price of UC Santa Cruz. The generosity and need-based for getting merit aid at the 123 is such now that it's not even something to consider, because the private actually charges you less than the public. So I think that's an important thing that you might want to think about. The third misconception, I'm going to go pretty quickly because I just have 10 more minutes, is about loan burden. And I'm going to hold up another one since I found my little things here. There was a front page, Sunday front page, May 12, 2012 in the New York Times. Great paper along with the Trib. Not as good as the Trib, but it's holding its own. Or the Sun-Times. Is Mike Farrow here? Or the Sun-Times, of course, not as good as that one either. But the New York Times, great paper, still the paper of record, many of us would say. They had a front page article, "A Generation Hobbled by the Soaring Cost of College." The opening line, "Poor Kelsey Griffin graduates on Sunday from Ohio Northern University. She has $120,000 in student debt. She's going to work 2 restaurant jobs and has to live with her parents. And, oh my God, it's just terrible." That is so misleading. In fact, there was an enormous literature. In fact, you and Sandy, Mike and Sandy Baum, wrote a piece saying all the numbers were wrong. It's not, right, as you pointed out, Mike, as it says, and believe it or not, in the New York Times, that 94% of college grads graduate with loans. It turns out it's 66%. It's still high, but it's not 94. And the average, even updating from your thing, thanks to Sandy, who gave me the latest number, so 1/3 of college attendees never have any loans. The 2/3 who do averaged last year, the most recent data, 26,600. So you got to hand it to the investigative journalists at the New York Times, because they found Kelsey Griffin. And she was not easy to find, because to find someone with $120,000 in student debt where fewer than 1% of all Americans graduate with over 100,000 takes remarkable journalism, but it's very misleading journalism. It's misleading journalism because the reality is, again, as I said, fewer than 1% of Americans graduate like poor Kelsey Griffin. And the other thing is, if you look, I'm going to get to in a second, the starting salaries for people with bachelor's degrees, I'm also going to make the point, it depends on where you went to school, but usually you can pay off those loans really well. Now, not if you then go to law school and you add on 120,000 or medical school and you add on 150,000. That's a different story. But if you're just talking about undergraduate debt, which is what the New York Times thought to be fit to the front page, this is a very misleading article. And let me go back to the Kofi schools. Right now, I looked it up yesterday. We get these data all the time for the 31 most highly selective privates. 58% of the graduates from last year, there's only 130,000 undergrads at Kofi, so they graduate about, say, 30, 35,000 a year. 58% graduated with no debt. Up from 50% in 2004, the average debt was $18,600. So if people pick up their New York Times and they believe this crap, and they really decide they're not going to Dartmouth and they're not going to Princeton because they don't want to take out a loan, they are out of their minds. Only 17% of last year's Kofi graduates graduated with a loan of more than $20,000. My previous school, Williams, got rid of loans, at least while I was president. My current position at Northwestern, we're very proud that anyone, at least in the bottom half of the American income distribution below, say, about 60,000 college-age kids, as I said before, they don't get packaged with any loan, and there's been a guarantee, a 4-year cumulative loan of about 20,000. So it's not surprising, but it's very misleading out there when you say this crushing loan burden that never is going to be paid off. And my real worry, as I alluded to a minute ago, is not that, we got to watch loans. I've been doing articles. Mike and I have been working on this for decades. You got to be careful about loans. It's going to affect, do you go to a for-profit or a not-for-profit loan burden? There's things you worry about, but to trivialize it and to just misstate the reality is very, very worrying, particularly in light of what I just said. The economic returns to higher education are at record levels. Now, I graduated college in 1975. Anybody remember 1975? There were a lot of drugs around there, but some of us remember, yeah, 1975, thank you. 1975, that turned out to be the trough of what we call the college premium. The college premium in the numerator is simply the amount of money you're expected to earn with a bachelor's degree. The denominator is what you would earn if you yourself stopped at college. Sometimes it's just the average salary for somebody with a college degree divided by the average salary for somebody with high school. That ignores selection bias. People who go on have certain characteristics. If Pat Ryan hadn't gone on to Northwestern, he probably still would have started Aon, right? So we don't want to take the full credit of you in the numerator. We want to adjust for the fact that certain people are so entrepreneurial, they would do well in either context. But even adjusted for selection bias, the college premium, the extra amount of money you yourself would make if you got a bachelor's degree as opposed to stopping in high school, is at a record level. The trough was 1975. Hi, Sam. Sorry about that. I just love the guy. I had to say that. So, in the 1960s, the number of unfilled jobs out there that demanded college degrees was very high. And some of you know economics, you reach an equilibrium with a cobweb. So what happened was they had a lot of jobs, and then a lot of people went into college like I did in 1971. But by the time we graduated in 1975, those jobs were all filled, right? And then you had all kinds of people with college degrees in professions that, in fact, didn't demand college degrees. That was the trough of it. And then what happened, it used to be a cycle. So it used to be you got a big return, too many people went to college, and it went down. In fact, some of you might remember there was a best-selling book written by a brilliant labor economist still at Harvard, Richard Freeman. And Dick Freeman wrote a book in 1976, get this, called The Overeducated American. Can you imagine writing that now, Bob? Never. And that was because, again, the college premium had plummeted. But what happened since then is it started increasing. Increases. There were periods of time, like 10, 12 years ago, where it looked like it sort of flattened, but it never went down again. The cycle is over. It's what economists or statisticians call a secular trend up. I think Tom Friedman's right. With the outsourcing to Guangdong province and Bangalore and Hyderabad and places like that of people with just high school skills, the college premium is going to increase and increase. One other thing, the point, if you really think it means if you're paying that tuition that your children and grandchildren are going to be as successful as you, it's important to note that economic studies show that as much as 2/3 of the increase in the college premium has not been an increase in the numerator, but a decrease in the denominator. In other words, it's more of a defensive move than it was, but economists don't care. Opportunity cost is cost, right? So for us, it's still a much better economic move to do it. So what happened was, the premium went up and it went up and up, and if you're going to scare people away from taking out loans, they're making a very bad decision. The next thing is two more very, very quickly in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Where you go to school matters. I love that when then President Clinton talked about everybody should go to college. I love when President Obama talks about everybody should go to college. But when you call it college, everybody knows the concept of a commodity, a product or a good undifferentiated by quality. Right? That's a commodity. College isn't a commodity. It's not. And where you go to school really does matter. And how I talked about it before. It matters more for a black guy than for a white guy, and for women than more than men. It matters, but where you go really matters. But here's one little point, and here's given a little props to a woman, Melissa Roderick, who's a very good faculty member at University of Chicago. And Mike and I had liked her work so much, and in one of the books we actually edited, the main article in that book was by her. And she looked at Chicago public school kids. And one of the most interesting parts of that analysis, she looked at the kids who were really the top, the kids who broke, even though they didn't have SAT tutors, and even though they only took it once, they broke 1,200 out of 1,600. They broke 27, or 27 or so into ACTs, and they were 3.5s and above. And she said, with race-sensitive admissions, we'll see what Justice Kennedy votes, but that could be a question for later, or income-sensitive admissions, which isn't going to be challenged, I think, in a Supreme Court ruling, with a thumb on the scale, those kids could get into, many of those kids, 3.9 valedictorians from an underserved Chicago public school with very good, by their standards, standardized test scores. They can go to Hyde Park, they can go to University of Illinois, Chicago, they can go down to the flagship in Urbana-Champaign, they can come up to Evanston to come to Northwestern. But the amazing thing that Melissa found, that of that relatively small group of superstars from CPS who not only graduated but thrived there, 2 out of 3 throw away the chance to go to a selective institution. They undermatch. In fact, Mike, one of the good books Mike wrote after me was a book in part about undermatching that he wrote with Bill Bowen, among others, in the public sector. So, that's an important thing to know, because it's not just price. It's not just using the financial aid calculator. It's sociology and it's psychology. There are reasons why, and you look at where these kids went, a lot of them went nowhere. Most of them went to community colleges or completely non-selective publics. And then the last thing to say very quickly, Melissa says, well, what happens to them when they get there? Are they big fish in small ponds? They maybe be middle of the class at Chicago or at Northwestern, but they went somewhere else, and maybe they really thrive, but the answer is they don't. Because a lot of those other schools where they went are so underfunded. I don't blame those schools, but they're so underfunded. There's a reason why their graduation rates aren't, 94% or 93% the way they are at Northwestern and WashU and Chicago and Duke. They're typically 20 to 30%. And one of the most interesting things Melissa did is took one of these kids, valedictorian, 1280 out of 1,600 SATs, 29 ACT, and said, what happens to that kid when the kid goes to a really underserved, under-resourced, non-selective public? And it turns out that the good news is if the average graduation rate at one of those schools was about 25%, they have maybe a 45% chance of graduating. But that's not the 95% chance they would be predicted to graduate if they went to a Kofi-type school or a very selective, a campus of the University of Illinois. So, that is really important to know, and it's very sobering, because Mike and I always thought if you could solve the problem and get rid of sticker shock and lower the net price, they would come. But again, that 2 out of 3 throw away this opportunity, and they're making a very, very bad financial decision. But again, I think it's less economics and it's more psychology and sociology. My final point is that the one big problem with the high economic return is that people forget about the public return. They forget about the social return. One of the best books about this ever was by an economist, not Bill Bowen from Mellon and Princeton, who himself has written many, many great books, but another great economist named Howard Bowen. Anybody remember this Howard Bowen? He was president of Grinnell. He was president of University of Iowa. He was president of Claremont Graduate School. He wrote a book in 1977 called Investment in Learning. And it was actually reissued in 20 years later, and Mike and I wrote the preface. Remember what we wrote in that preface? We said that it was really funny that a labor economist writing a book called Investment in Learning didn't say anything about the economic return. Why didn't he say anything about the economic return? There was none. He wrote it in 1977. That's when I graduated in 75, right? So if you look at the chapters, and this is my last thing for you to think about, one was called Enhancing Citizenship. You know, you get a college degree, you're more likely to vote. You're more likely to volunteer. Making better health choices in terms of drinking and fatty foods and cigarettes. Staying out of jail, you know, one thing after another. And it was all about the non-pecuniary or non-monetary returns. And I think that people forget that. And sometimes people are out there and they say, you know, why should we subsidize Pell Grants? Why should we continue to support Urbana-Champaign and UIC and all these schools? Well, they forget that they serve the public good. They really do. And they should just look at Howard Bowen's Investment in Learning and remember that the social return is high. And this really is the last thing. And I want to add this because I was talking to the table before. One thing that really gets me mad, you might have seen the op-ed in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. It was a response to the North Carolina governor. I told you I brought video aids here. You know, this came out last week. The governor of North Carolina was interviewed by William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, on a national public radio or national radio program, not NPR. No, trust me, that ain't going to happen. But anyway. And he was asked, you know, how do you feel as the governor? You know, it's one of the public ivies is Chapel Hill. How do you feel about people studying the liberal arts? And he said, you know, I don't understand. Here's his quote. You can't make this up. He said, you know, I have legislation now that will change the basic formula of how education money is given out to our universities and community colleges. You know, I'm not interested in putting butts in the seats, but I want to make sure those butts can get jobs. And he said, I question publicly the value of supporting liberal arts majors, you know, and then he makes some joke about gender studies. If you want to study gender studies, you can go to Duke and do it. Don't expect a state subsidy. And then he went on with Bill Bennett says, you know, what about philosophy? Oh, yeah, how many philosophy majors do we need? And they both laughed. Now, it's not that funny because the governors of Texas, Florida, and Wisconsin have also said similar things, that somehow, why is there a public interest in funding the humanities? Well, they should read Howard Bowen's book. Simply as that. You know, when I testify a couple of times in Washington with Mike or without Mike, and I talk about the returns, and when I mention in enhancing aesthetic sensibilities, which is one of the chapters in Howard Bowen's, but people laugh. They literally laugh. Like, why should we pay for that? You know why they should pay for that? Because what would life be without great literature, without music, without great theater, without great dance? And where the hell are we going to create this if we don't subsidize the liberal arts? The irony is somehow, you know, that, and this is, you know, we're going to charge more, or Clay Christensen, the scariest thing was Clay Christensen, the brilliant, you know, the founder of this disruptive innovation, Harvard Business School's arguably greatest professor. He writes this full-page thing again in the New York Times, and he calls on this crazy thing. He says, why are we giving Pell Grants to people who are studying liberal arts? Why don't we just limit it to the STEM fields? Are you believe me? What kind of an America would it be? We might be rich, but would it really be life worth living if we didn't have literature and all that? And the final thing about the hypocrisy, and that's why, but I think we deserve some of the blame because we're only focused on the economic return. But there are two problems with this, and when I mentioned Jane Shaw, who I never heard of, runs some higher ed center that I also never heard of, but maybe that's me and not her. And she writes this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago, I guess, and she says, you know, this is great, we got to get this out. And she goes and she says, we're doing a real disservice. Elite universities have all these majors and none of these kids have job prospects. She goes on and says, the governor understated the case. Many liberal arts graduates, even from the best schools, have no jobs. That's completely wrong. I always tell my students, you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your facts. Now, if you look at an age earning profile, you know, it might turn out that somebody with mechanical engineering starts here and someone with English literature is down here, but usually the slope is faster. You know, you increase your affluence more rapidly from the liberal arts and non-quantitative social sciences. And it really worries me from a public policy point of view that these people are out there saying, you know, we should charge more because it's self-indulgent to study philosophy. And then this literally is the final comment. What's really ironic is that Bill Bennett himself, as Mike knows very well, was a philosophy major at Williams. And Jane S. Shaw, may she long thrive, because I never heard of her, but I looked her up. English literature major at Wellesley. Last I looked, they're both employed. Thank you. Yeah, time for a couple questions. I hope I provoked something. The board knows I like to be provocative. I hope it wasn't too provocative. Yeah, we have some questions here. I'm gonna do like really quick answers to these questions. Because Mike, you did like 12 questions in 3 minutes. You answered. I'm gonna do that too. Or maybe I'll even have you up and answer them.
We all know how presidents like to take advice on that. I'll be watching you. Here we go. This is from Valerie Korn, a guest of the City Club. What impact will online learning have on universities like Northwestern?
Oh boy, Dan Linzer, my provost, is Mr. Expert about that. You know, I'm very excited about it. I've never seen the promise of technology save money. Maybe because I'm only 59 and I wasn't there for the steam engine or something. It probably cost us money like everything else. But I'm pretty hopeful. You know, massive open online courses are important. You know, we're going to do a deal with not only Coursera, but also Tutor or 2U. I guess we haven't announced that yet, so just ignore that. But you have to be aggressive. You have to think about these things. But you know what? It doesn't replace the 4-year residential experience. You know, you go down to Urbana-Champaign, or you go to Hyde Park, or you go to WashU, you know, in St. Louis, you're going to have a very different maturation experience. And while I think there's something we all call alien credit, and that's not for studying in the University of Mars or something. No, alien credit is credit you get towards a degree from advanced placement courses in high school, from study abroad programs you don't run, from summer school programs you don't run, etc. And I think that we would be counting MOOCs you know, towards alien credit, but never to replace what really happens in the classroom, which is, I think, magical. Next, yes.
Hold your applause to the next question. This is
If then, yes.
This is from Glenn. Is that Mazaid? Close enough. RBS Citizens Charter 1. I'll just read the first line because it's perfect segue, sir.
Okay.
What is Northwestern's investment in online education?
Well, like I said, yeah, we're doing it and we're excited. And there's very big differences between a Coursera, which is asynchronous. You can do it in the middle of the night in your pajamas. There's no credit. There's no selection process, you know, for admissions. And U2, or I'm sorry, Tutor, or now called 2U, where in fact it is synchronous. Everybody's just remote, but it's at the same time. You get credit, you pay tuition, there's selective admissions. We're looking into both. But the real thing, and I had a meeting with Secretary Duncan a couple weeks ago in his office, and we were talking about that. And I made a point that I think he liked, and I said, you know, when the Stanfords and MITs are doing this, and they're doing it for the rest of us, but when they start giving credit for their own students, then it's going to really matter. And that's what I was talking about, whether they're even part of alien credit versus the mainstream of credit granting. That's going to be a different world, and I don't see that world happening, to tell you the truth. Yes?
3 more questions.
3 more questions, okay.
And then we'll have some last ones. Okay.
Is he mocking me? Is he mocking me?
Charlie, you see, Charles Middleton is not the only guy I pick on. There you go. Here we go. President Roosevelt. Here we go. From Carolyn Craycroft. Right up your alley here.
Yeah, I hope so.
Philosophers were among the key workers in the development of the computer and the internet.
Yeah.
Good question.
Thank you. Very good point. But again, it speaks to, you know, this trashing the liberal arts. The idea that, you know, if anything, it's so funny because, you know, I've spent time at Cambridge and Oxford, you know, where they charge more, a surcharge for the STEM fields. Listen to what these governors are saying. They're going to subsidize it more heavily, and the surcharge is going to be if you study literature and music and art. Where we're going to be without art? You know, it's just staggering. So it's a very good point. Yes?
This is from Alberto Ortega. Nice long question. I used to mentor kids and ask, is it better to get a degree and have a debt or no degree without debt? This is how kids perceive the decision to go to college.
If you're going to go into debt and you're not going to graduate, a lot of the undermatched kids in the Melissa Roderick and friends study from University of Chicago shows that that was a pretty bad economic decision. But, again, as I tried to make clear, and if you want to talk later and I can tell you a little bit more about the empirical literature that Mike and I contributed, among others, that, take the debt, go to the most selective school you can, unless you're a white man, where it matters much less, and then cash it in. It's a ticket to not only, aesthetic sensibilities and perhaps enhancing religious faith. I'm looking at my friend Shirley Ryan. It's another thing people never talk about in secular higher education, except for me, and I talk about it literally every day. But, there are a lot of things you get out of higher education, and, to not avail yourself of access to capital markets in order to do it is the worst financial decision you'll ever make.
How about a big round of applause?
Okay, yeah.
Wait a minute. You don't leave empty-handed, sir.